Doing the retreat in Nevada City this last weekend, I realized that I very much enjoy working with working with people. Can you Did I realize that I enjoy working with people? No, it's not that. And I do. But I also enjoy what I'm pointing to is working with groups of people, which is what it'll be groups of people at a time. Maybe a group of people that I'm leading an inquiry in a video like this, where you're just sitting at home and resting as awareness. I'm just taking you through to look at certain things, or a live meeting like on Zoom. More interaction, more engagement with people doing this work by the facilitators of this work. That's where I am going. Yes, that I feel a movement towards that. Well, since my back pain, my spine issue, the pain went away, I felt a draw because I knew that something happened in the healing of that back pain. I knew that something was now special or different about the work, in that it pulled me out of the hole of chronic pain when no one and nothing else could. So I think then I understood the power of, more than ever, the power of work like this, not to just awaken us to what we are, to just, right? Because that's what most people are in it for, but to embody that and let there be whatever healing will take place for oneself. Here, we cannot promise anything. There is no promise. That's important to say. Um, an illness, you look for answers. People look for answers. They look for hope. So here, I have to tell you, there's no guarantee of anything. Nothing. There's nothing that I don't want to do any kind of putting out false hopes to anyone. There's too much hype in the world around things, saying if you this will happen or whatever. And this work for me has to be different. The way that we talk about it has to be different than that. There can be no promises because there's so many factors that factor into something like that, like whether someone will see through, overcome, have something dissolve, heart opening. It's not just, it's as much about that as it is things like, what kinds of trauma did you experience when you were a child? How much or what do you repress in terms of emotions? Is there a level of earnestness and readiness in you to do the more radical work on the programs that really drive your life, the stories? Where does that come from? Is that there? And if it's not there, how will you do this work? Because for this work, it is radical. It's a radical undoing of, just everything, if you're in it fully. That's what awakening is about, generally. So enlightenment. This is why I like Aj's book, The End of Your World. This work is first and foremost about waking up from the dream of separation. That's what it's about. That's what it's always been about. Through the years, it gets a little clouded up because people come for different reasons. But let me say that just this is what this work, I think, is really here for. I know that people can use it to deal with singular issues. I get that. For example, I'm working with some people who they just have like an issue in their relationship that's about to tear their relationship up. So they come and do this work to harmonize that feature of their relationship, or to harmonize the relationship, to overcome the issue, the historical issue, trauma trigger that keeps making the relationship difficult. And then they leave once that's settled. Yeah, that happens. But first and foremost, if you've been with me through the years, you know that I am singularly focused as a teacher or whatever else I am on the radical awakening. And what does that mean? You know, that you hear the teachings that say, you know, and I've even said it, where I sort of poke fun at the emphasis on no self, like teachings that just focus on it. But my poking fun at that is just to simply say, yes, include that and go beyond that. That's how I see it. Yes, include that, but go beyond that. If you include that and then you see that that's one facet of it, you can move beyond that to deeper realizations, to the refinement of that, the embodiment of that, whatever else has to be seen for you. But that's very much one of the realizations that happens along the way that I've seen people realize is no self, for example. That's an awakening out of some identity that they had before that. You could say ego. Something clearly happens. And that should never be, you know, tossed to the side or downplayed in this work because these things are important. These insights, these realizations are important. It's easy for someone who's already had those insights or realizations to say, oh, yeah, that's not the whole thing. But they are important, and they were in my life and continue to be in people's lives. So, this work is about waking up from really the dream of separation and deficiency. And in that dream, that illusory world where you believe everything you think, essentially, that's one of the hallmarks of it. You just believe something because you're thinking it. And then when you believe something, then it looks like the world contains the things that you believe. You don't recognize yet that it's being projected out, that your thoughts are your only link to what you're seeing in the world, that your thoughts are creating the experience of everything you're seeing, including this experience of self as a permanent, solid, separate, ongoing, long-lasting entity that lives from past to future. It really is very convincing that you're a long-lasting entity. And I can tell you that you're not. And that's all a dream happening right there in front of you, in this data in front of you. So that's a big part of this work because why would you skip over that, right? But people come, not skip over it, but people come not focused on that because they have like a pressing issue in their life. So it could be addiction or like me for chronic pain or some historical trigger like trauma. So they come just specifically for that, which is fine. But I think it's important for me to continue to come out here and say, this isn't really a set of tools or a therapy to fix a particular thing. I mean, you can use it that way. It's not how it was intended. And I've even said that in my Natural Rest for Addiction book. That really what resting as awareness and inquiry is about is a radical deconstruction of the reality or deprogramming of the consciousness that is you. And one of the things that comes along the way in that is the recognition that you're not that entity, that time-bound, thought-based entity that you think you are. That if you just sit back for a moment, you can see how it feels like you exist in time. And this is what this is what shields us from death too, because when we feel so permanent, and not permanent, but substantial and long lasting in our minds. That's all. It's all our mind, in the mind. We only know a self through these thoughts, but these thoughts paint the picture of, oh, I have this past, and all of that is me, including everything that happened is me. And as it appears now in my consciousness as thought, it's me. The thing is it's not appearing in my consciousness. That's why I can refer back to it and remember what it's like for many people listening, where you literally think that you're the story. For years, I've just pointed them, like non-dual teachers do, to recognize you're not that ego, to wake up, so to speak, from it, which just means to see that isn't you. Those are thoughts, feelings coming and going, and you've never examined it or inquired into it, perhaps, or you not deeply enough because you still believe that that's you. And so the dream continues. So I've been pointing to that forever, and there are 6 books written on that. I've written 6 books on pointing to the non-dual experience, not just the experience of I am awareness or I am witness, but you are that there is no separation anywhere. So you could see then that a lot of the work that I talk about on here, like, the inquiry, the somatic stuff, the repression, trauma, addiction, all of that is really just what that is, or those are the areas I think that make up suffering. People have asked, I'm doing this video because of a couple of conversations I've had. People really, because the work is becoming more popular. We're not even really advertising anywhere this work. There may be a few like ad spends on Facebook, but even really lately we haven't even been doing that. Because people are learning about this work through word of mouth. So if you're coming to this work through word of mouth or otherwise, and you're coming for a particular issue, you should know that this work is not based on, like, it's not just a set of tools that fixes a particular problem. Although I know people use it for that reason, and I don't have a problem with that. Why should I? But what I'm saying is, let's not lose sight of the bigger picture here, because there is something more vital that's available here than rather than just, can I overcome my food addiction, or can I let go of the memory of dad yelling at me or whatever. See, the way that stuff came about is there's nobody here on this side that decided that we're going to go create a set of tools that will work on all these situations. But strangely, KI has become this thing that you can literally apply to anything. I mean, if you know what reverse inquiry is, then you know that it has a way of just cleaning up your consciousness. So I can imagine like someone I know that there are people who use the work for this. They're golfers or tennis players, but their head and their mind gets in the way. They're dancers, they're actors, engineers. Their head gets in the way. They can't be present in their job or in their art. And so the deficiency stories and all the self-talk is there. So just through reverse inquiry, it's like they can see everything that they believe, and they can see why they've been sabotaging. And then as they stay with it, that goes quieter and quieter, and they're able just to be completely different in that situation, whether it's playing tennis, meaning in the flow, not in their heads, and able to perform better. So I know that that's just one of the things that people use the work for, and it can work like that. But I just don't want to lose sight of. I've never personally lost sight of what this work is really about. Even when I throw darts at other teachings, that's just Scott being subversive. If you know Scott, then you'll know that he's subversive. If you don't know me in my personal life, that's a word that people use to describe me. Subversive. I haven't looked it up in a while. I just want you to understand where I come from here. Seeking or intending to be subversive, establish a system, or instant, that doesn't help us, does it? I just don't remember the word. I have a feel for what the word means. But let me just say this. Okay. Undermine the power and authority of an established system. Okay. I didn't realize it was that. Yes. So this work is very subversive. I probably have that in my personality. That's why people have said that. My husband calls me 100% nonconformist. Although, if you were to meet me on the street, you wouldn't see that. But in terms of society's rules and the way that the conditioning and the stuff, so that's why this shows up in the work, and so that's why you see me undermining things. If you've heard me talk about 12-step in a way that seems to undermine it, if you've heard me talk about non-dual awakening or the way that is taught, me undermining it, it's simply because in the work that here we're doing is that we're waking up to what is, for sure. It's presence-based work. But then when that dawns on us, we're just sort of pointing out all the areas of BS that 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 can happen in this. And I have been full of shit. Like that's where some of that subversive nature comes from, is recognizing, wow, Scott, you really believe some shit here. I mean, when I first started teaching, I still had, at the very beginning, there was this sense of specialness just in the beginning. And here I was out there teaching, not recognizing I still think I'm special. And that thing needed to go. And other things along the way that get undermined, including undermined all belief systems, because belief systems are fuel or they're food for the ego. It's how the ego lives and thrives in the reality, is it creates its own reality and then believes that it's reality. So undermining belief systems. So if I see belief systems anywhere, including here, you'll hear me talk about that. If I see it in 12 step, if that seems to be harming people in any way, and at a certain point, although belief systems are good for a certain, there are no levels of consciousness, but for a certain level of consciousness, beliefs work. They work for me. But you don't want to cater to that. Like when we start waking up out of that, you don't want to have to be nice all the time to say, oh, yeah, not say anything about that, because those of us who are moving out of beliefs, like just all beliefs, really, because we see the suffering in it, we have a voice too. And so part of the voice is to point out how belief systems are continuing to create suffering for people. So that shows up as being subversive. Sometimes people have said that. But for me, I've always just, I use the word me freely. It's not real, but nothing else is either. So I wouldn't be able to say anything if I started doing that. So I have always been interested in really radical deprogramming, because it's incredibly liberating. And this is why you hear me say, like, oh yeah, all those non-dual pointers that you've been clinging to, that your mind is still repeating, that goes. And all the insights, the special insights and experiences that we have along the way that are so important when we have them, and actually so helpful when we have them, that has to go. And any attachment to that, the idea that we're awakened, that we're an awakening process, that has to go, because that just becomes the new programming. That's pretty radical for people, for some people. So trauma, it's like being open and earnest around any historical trigger. Trauma is just one kind of historical trigger. That gets included. Addictions, those behaviors, that gets included. Grief, unresolved grief, that gets included. Repression. So you can see how what we're doing is we're really just being radical about it. And so but it shows up like, oh, the KI works for addiction. It shows up that way. Like, oh, KI is good for trauma. It just shows up that way because those who developed this word, mainly me and Dan, are very much interested in radical deprogramming. That's Dan too. You just don't know him as well. And that's what it's about. And that's what Dan and I have talked about since the beginning, of how the different paradigms, including spiritual paradigms, they've been great to help people. And if you're not careful, they become the new programming, which is fine. But when you're in that, you really don't see it though. That's where it gets nutty, because it's like you could be in a tradition that has a belief system there, but if the tradition itself is about awakening from the illusion of ego, accept the illusion of the teaching. You see what I'm saying? So there are people who are using these teachings and methods, or teachers, to wake up, not recognizing that part of the sleepiness is the method or the teaching itself. Like that's part of the illusion. But there are people who are like half baked, because it's like they're using their tradition or their vehicle to awaken to their true nature. But then in awakening to that, they cling to their particular, conceptual framework or belief system or programming, and then just bringing more from there, bringing more division and separation to the world in the name of spirituality. I was talking about that yesterday. Like, to be radical is where all the walls come down. The walls that you built for your spiritual tradition, or that the walls that you climbed into in order to have your awakening experiences or to transcend whatever else, that conveyor belt helped you. But at what point will you then wake up out of that? And that is a thing that happens. I won't mention the teacher. He's actually a friend of mine. I won't mention the name, but we will wait to say this. We know that there have been teachers in monasteries who really were like Christian or Buddhist monks or whatever, and they woke up out of that. And then they came to, present a different way of teaching to the world because they woke up out of that. They took it that far. So that's where that's the kind of the spirit of this work is. But the thing is with this work, there's no place to sit on top of any mountain. Because even if you transverse a lot of the stuff, that stuff, and you wake up out of this, wake up out of 12 steps. Just wake up one day and realize that it's all belief, or much of it is belief. Just wake up out of it, or whatever it is. Then it's not like, oh, I'm really enlightened. No, it's not that at all. It's pulling the rug out from under you. So as you get the rug pulled out from under you, the very last thing that you can do out of that is make a self out of that. Because the self was the set of beliefs. There wasn't a self other than whatever was clinging to those beliefs or that framework. So when that clinging happens, it's not like there's going to be more of a self here that's more awakened than other people. It's not that at all. It's the opposite of that. It's, for me, as I go deeper, it's the only thing that encapsulates it in the end is like, who cares? It's that story where I won't tell you the whole story, but the teacher and the student. So the student keeps sending letters to the teacher. I've realized this and this and this and the non-dual nature of reality and all this. And the teacher reads it and crumples it up and throws it away. Student writes back later, a few months later, I've realized that was all bullshit, but now I've seen this, and this, and the blah, blah, blah. And the teacher sees it, throws it away. And then eventually the student sends a letter in that says, who cares? And the teacher smiles and very happy, very content, folds the piece of paper up very neatly as if to save it. Yeah, that is what I'm pointing to. But it isn't a who cares like in a nihilistic way at all. For me, the who cares is like truly letting go of one's spiritual resume, having no desire really to let anyone know that they're enlightened, even if one talks about enlightenment, no claim of personal ownership, no desire to stand on top of any mountain. The mountain isn't real, all of that. So that can be pretty radical for those who, for example, if you're in a tradition that makes that state of awakening or whatever it is, an exalted state, or even, yeah, because to me, the awakening becomes very ordinary, and that's why it's useful. Let's talk about that for a second. I don't know how useful it would be if, as the result of awakening, we just have humans conditioned and programmed to go around just speaking spiritual stuff all the time. Like, that's the only thing that happens when you wake up, is that you just become a mouthpiece for waking up. What I talk about on YouTube for the rest of the day, unless I'm in session, I don't even talk about this. I don't. Because to me, the real work of awakening is to put you right back into your life where you never left, and to live out that unfolding, to see how that shows up in the world, in life, as in a human life. So you'll never get to have that experience if you keep hanging on to the things on your resume. And I realize that the things that we're looking for or seeking, that we're going to be focused on those things. But as that dawns on us, we're even letting that go. Is what I mean. Just letting it go. Because that same clinging that clings to that programming is no different than the clinging that cling to any other concepts or stories or programs that led to the seeking. But it's not nihilism. Not if you do it right. It's like when those questions start to arise for you, like whether life is meaningless, or if you have skillful inquiry, you can recognize those for what they are and let go of those kind of questions. Those kind of things. Just letting go of things that are weight on your life. Like what we're essentially letting go of is just the sense that anything is inherent or separate. But we don't let go of the world. The world is an illusion. So how do you let go of an illusion? All these people trying to let go or transcend or get out of. It's like, well, this is the only world that we have. And it just happens to be illusion. But there is no other reality to go to, even if you, so this is the world. And if you go to just, okay, I'm silent space or pure awareness, where there's no concepts and no sense of, no even honoring relative reality at all, you're not going to be able to function. Right? For me, the non dual awakening just simply provided the foundation in which to live this human life. That's what it did for me. It didn't, yeah, the transcendent, that which is, okay, the wisdom is knowing that I'm nothing. See it that way. I'm nothing. And there is nothing inherently here. That's a real insight, a real realization. And those pointers that then say, I am everything. Love is seeing that I'm everything. Wisdom is seeing that I'm nothing. Love is seeing that I'm everything. That's pointing to something else. Or embodiment, the word embodiment is pointing to something else, in which the awakening is so embodied in your life that you're fully engaged in your human life. There's nothing to run from, because that's where you'll find whatever leftover bondage is there. So if you take that very seriously in this lifetime, it's like you leave your awakening behind, and here you are in life. And then, yes, the world is an illusion, but it's the only world that you have, the one that you see. And so you live that life, now watching for where you may still reify something, or it may seem that something is inherently there and they'll be suffering with it. That's the embodiment process. Is like paying attention to how the body holds on to something still as real and inherent, and then being open to that and integrating that, seeing through that. So that you no longer feel the separation in that area, whatever that is. So hanging on to our spiritual resume can create a sense of separation still. Or really identifying with our particular tradition, if we don't hold it very lightly, easily becomes a new way of separation. It's like, why can't a Buddhist and a Hindu just sit in a room together and agree on everything? They can't. They may agree on some basics, but they're going to disagree on a lot of things. And why is that? Because the path for each of those people is what helped each one of those people. But along the path, as you're doing this deconstruction work, seeing things as illusion, the self, others, the world, all of that, with each tradition, you're being told to interpret it a certain way. When you have a realization in Buddhism, you're told to interpret it a certain way, in Hinduism a certain way, in Christian mysticism a certain way. And then in that certain way, if you're not careful, becomes the new program, is what I mean. And so then our interpretations get mistaken for the realization. So in other words, we really think that our concepts about awakening are the only true concepts. That's the ignorance. I think it's still pretty rare now for people to still have a tradition or a framework about how to think about things and then just to hold it very lightly. Follow me for a second. Just go with me on this for a second, because this is something that we often can't see within ourselves. Like, this would be something that if I were doing this, I wouldn't probably know it. You would probably catch me and you would say, ah, yeah, he does this. He believes this. It's so blinding, or it's so unconscious. But here's what it is. It's like the framework or the interpretation that you've used in your own, or that I've used in my own experience to translate or interpret the things that happen along the way on the path. Like whether I say this about it or that about it, whether it's Christ consciousness or Brahman or emptiness in this school of Buddhism. Those are all good frameworks that help us to awaken to what we are. They're different frameworks, but what happens is we use the framework and then we forget that it is just a framework. Like, that's all that it is. It's just a map. And so then instead of seeing it as just a map and being more interested in the direct experience, we may hang on to the map so much so that we start believing that the map is the reality. And this is really subtle. Because if you're someone who's just spouting the concepts of your particular map, you'll be convinced that your concepts are the only true concepts. Because that's the only thing you know. You don't know what, for example, if you're a Buddhist in this particular school of Buddhism, you don't know that Hinduism or Advaita Vedanta actually interprets it differently than what you're saying. So watching a Buddhist and a Hindu talk about this is, you can really see this issue of how tightly one holds on to one's worldview or spiritual perspective. It all shows up in relationship. So the way that Greg Good first introduced this to me, this idea of holding lightly whatever you think is true, because everybody has a final language, right? Like each of us sitting here right now, we have a way of explaining reality or with language, whether it's political language or spiritual language or whatever. We all have a final language. Even if the language is, there is no separation, it's all one, there's no self, that's our language. It all depends on how tightly you hold on to that language. This is where it gets really refined and nuanced. It's like where there's an encouragement to go deeper, that not everybody takes that invitation at this place. That people will land right where they think, where they've taken their map or their framework to be the real and only framework. They kind of land there because the map helped them to awaken through that tradition. So of course there would be a devotion to the map, or an adherence, or devotion to that particular map. So that it's held tightly. And the teaching itself, or the framework or tradition itself, then isn't seen to be part of the illusion. It's it's a belief like this map is explaining reality. It's not illusion. It's explaining how reality really is. It's very, very convincing because that's all you know. We've been around teachers for however many years saying the same things over and over again. After a while, it gets built in to your consciousness where you easily can mistake the concepts for ultimate truth, but it becomes your new programming. If you're interested in going deeper than that, inquire with us. One of the first realizations that I had was how all the different schools and religions and traditions, that they're literally illusory. Like there's no divisions there. We're making them up. We're making them up. The division between this Christian thing and that Christian thing, or this Christian thing and that Buddhist thing, or this school of Buddhism and that, and then this and then that and then this and that. It's all part of the illusion. It all feeds into the separation, but maybe at a higher level or a different level, because these schools of thought, these spiritual traditions, are all pointing to non-separation, or that's what they tend to point to ultimately. But how it gets contextualized and then believed ends up reinforcing separation. There's a difference between holding on to a framework or something like that tightly, really for a sense of self, even though it's subtle. You can't tell that that's what it is, but it is. It's based in fear. It's based in a fear of real annihilation, where you don't even get to hold on to that anymore. So our spiritual frameworks are sometimes the last ones to go, because it's like the last thing that we're clinging to. We let go or transcend it or seen the emptiness of other things. But the interpretation of our spiritual realization might be one of the last things that we cling to. And if you can see it as just more ego, it'll help you go deeper. If you just continue to spout that the way that you're saying it is the truth, then you're not going to see it. That's no different than any ego saying that what they're saying is really true. It doesn't matter if the stuff is just spiritual concepts, it's the same mechanism. And look at, if you sit here and contemplate the true end of your world, as Adya says, the true end of your world, where everything, everything must go. That includes this framework that you're holding tightly to. Because think of that for a moment. What does it bring up when you imagine that everything that you even think about spirituality is also illusion, and that you can't cling and hold on to that anymore? See, if that creates fear, then you see what I mean. It's like it's a fear of really being annihilated here. And that's where I think a lot of the clinging to the frameworks comes from, is just a good old fear of annihilation. So is this the world that we're going to have, where we wake up or we transcend, or within a particular tradition, only to hold tight to that tradition and believe that that's reality, and then now we just have a bunch of separation out of that now? Or are we going to hold our interpretations very lightly so that we can actually begin to see the other, like actually see everyone for what they really are, instead of seeing through our interpretation? So as we awaken, are we still seeing Buddhists and Christians, or is that what we're still seeing? Are we still saying that you're a Buddhist, or that how are you holding tight to your tradition or your framework, and then what kind of separation does that set up in your life and in the world? But when you meet someone who holds something lightly, it's like it feels like they just have a wardrobe on, a set of clothing on, that they don't even think is really what they are, but they just wear this clothing because maybe it looks, they like this clothing. It's like that. So someone may show up, and this is how, to me, this is how Greg Good showed up to me as a teacher, is when I would speak to him, it's like he knew all this stuff about this school of Buddhism or Hinduism, direct path, but yet it all felt just like clothing that he would put on. I could tell that he didn't really think that he was these things. It just felt like he wasn't identified with any of the things. And so he could just put on different clothing. So he would start talking about direct path, Advaita. And when he was talking about it, it was very powerful. But then in the next moment, he would just shift over to a different framework, like philosophical or something. And then that wardrobe would go off, and he would start talking about emptiness in the way that they talk about it in a particular school of Buddhism. And he'd be very enthusiastic about it. And then that would fall away. And being with someone like that, it's almost impossible to be in conflict with someone like that. And it's also, I think, still pretty rare. Many of the teachers that I meet, they don't have that, because they're still holding tightly to the framework or the language that they've used to awaken. And so they're, holding on to it. And so it doesn't feel like wardrobe that they're just putting on for a second. It feels like armor, or I don't know what the metaphor is. It breaks down right there. But this work, I think, is for those people who want to go to the place where they don't hold on even to their final language tightly. Radical seeing through of separation, including the separation that gets created or seemingly created through holding tight to our particular way of talking about things. That's incredibly liberating. I don't know if you can feel that, or the prospect of that, with truly nothing to hold on to. Not even your most favored insights, framework, or anything. Wow, how did the talk get there? I don't know. The point being is that, people have been asking questions as more and more people come here to this work. They're asking questions. One person said, or not just questions, they're making comments about the work. Like, this work includes it all. They'll say, like, meditation, mindfulness, non-dual somatic process, and it's therapeutic and all this stuff. Yeah, it has a lot of those elements, but ultimately it's still about, in my experience, it's about awakening to what we really are and then embodying that. 100 years ago, we didn't have information like we have it now. Like, we have information about trauma. We have information about addiction like never before. We have information about shame that we didn't have before, about emotional repression that we didn't have before. And if you go way far back, maybe people just called that suffering in certain traditions. It's just suffering. But now we have other information where we can see, well, what is the suffering? And you can really see that it falls into these areas. That we don't just have to call it suffering. It is. But if we get more granular and we take a look at it like a microscope, we see that we can hone in on compulsion, for example, or addiction, and find the suffering that drives that. So there it's good to be specific, because what drives compulsion is like categories of things like trauma. Science tells us drives compulsion, shame, emotional repression drives it. So in illuminating these different areas, that's where I think people say, oh, so this is work that's for addiction. No, not ultimately. Addiction is just one kind of suffering that can happen. And so it gets included in this work, because to embody awareness, one has to kind of deal with that issue. Or trauma. We talk about trauma, and then people might say, oh, this is really a good trauma approach. It really isn't a trauma approach. It's just that trauma is one of the kinds of suffering that stops people on the path, or becomes a seeming or apparent hindrance on the path, the body holding the past. So in order to be talking about a radical awakening, we have to include that. But it just gets included as part of the overall thing here. It's not a trauma approach any more than it's a grief approach, or an approach on any of the drivers. If you can step back and let me just say it in the simplest terms, what this work is really about, or what it was created for, is the recognition of what you really are. And putting to rest any of the identities of separation, those being illusory. So that includes for me an embodiment process, because the separation part of it is held in the body and unconscious. So the trauma that hasn't been resolved, when you actually pull it up, there's separation there. There's belief in I'm not safe, or whatever programs are there, Velcro to some sensation. So that's identification. So that gets included in it. See? So the embodiment is the big piece of this. And when I came out and talked about chronic pain now, people are saying, oh, some people come very freshly to the work and they say, oh, so this is a work that works on chronic pain. Yes and no. The chronic pain thing came about as part of the embodiment process. Just in my own personal experience, intense chronic spine pain, 3 diagnosed conditions, excruciating pain at times. The inquiries went in and saw the leftover identifications around anger, repression, and some unresolved trauma. So it's just a process of then including all of that, integrating all of that for a deeper embodiment. And then what happened is the pain went away. But that's not what this is ultimately about. I'm glad the pain went away. I'm grateful, very grateful the pain went away. But that's not what this is ultimately about, because life goes on. It's about continuing to be what I am and embody that. So whatever else comes, that's where it will go. Whatever else hasn't been embodied in my own experience or included, I assume will be included, because that's how the path has been for me. I hope that my talk on embodiment is clear enough why I talk about it. If you haven't recognized awareness yet, if it hasn't dawned on you how the presence is like foundational to your experience, like you could say it's what you really are. If that hasn't really settled in fully, I can see how the embodiment might not make complete logical sense. Maybe it does already, though. But for me, it's very simple. It's you've recognized what you are, and that realization is there for you. Maybe all the time, maybe you're abiding in it. The body, see, pay attention to the body at that point, because if there's still an oscillation, like getting pulled out of that recognition, somehow believing for a moment or for a while that you're this or you're that, notice how the body is playing into that at that point. It's keeping the score. This is like really logical stuff for me. It's very obvious, but I think I should explain it in case it's not obvious for people. The anger repression work was an old identification, period. It was an identification way back there that said even as a teacher, so people say, how could that happen? You've seen through well, it happens, but it shows up like that. It doesn't show up like consciously, like, oh yeah, I have to repress anger. Because if it was conscious like that, it would have already been seen through, like anything else. But it was back here. And come to find out, instead of being physical pain, it was just that. It was, I have to repress anger. I can't get angry. I can't be aggressive. So for me, that was just including that. Okay, that's being believed. There's a sense of identification there. And then seeing through it. And then in seeing through it, there's a deeper stabilization. I don't know how else to say that. Deeper stabilization as in the whole experience of it. This is a live work. It's very live, to say it that way. Because as we embody this stuff, it does change the dynamic of one's experience. Even if it's just in subtle ways, it changes the dynamic of one's experience. It feels just more like home. Can I say it that way? When you fully embody something that you've been pushing away or repressing or remaining unconscious, there's a lot of energy that gets taken up in doing that and resisting to looking at something and keeping some repression or trauma alive by not looking at it. There's an incredible amount of energy that it takes to keep that going. And it has a direct bearing on our lives. So when that goes away, it's like it's even sweeter, this, because all that energy is no longer being expended in that area. And that energy is then freed up in some way. See? So it's alive. And it becomes increasingly about that the aliveness of this. That it's not a dead realization. It's not a dry or flat. I am the disembodied emptiness. It's like the forms are alive. The realization is alive in everything that you see. And everything gets included. Love is seeing that I'm everything. Nothing is left off the table. It all gets included, even your worldview. So the worldview that you may be clinging to, that I was talking about, your, well, political but spiritual worldview, that any separation that brings about gets transcended, and that's makes the realization even more alive, because belief systems are dead. They're not reality. They're shielding us from reality. So for that particular one, where we're really buying into our spiritual framework, really believe that the things that I'm saying are ultimately true, like missing that's dead, because that's shielding you perhaps from the fear of annihilation, like true annihilation. So it's a distraction from dealing with something, fear. And if that's not the case, then prove me wrong. Like, if there's no fear of letting go of your favorite way of thinking or talking about life, then just let go of it and stop talking about it in that way, and see if there's actually fear, or is there a clinging as I invite you to do that? Is there a sense like, no, I'm not ready for that? Or even a resistance to what I'm saying? Is there a resistance to dismantling your most precious frameworks and holding them lightly? That resistance is the fear. See that? So even at that higher level, when our final language is spiritual, it can deaden our experience and not allowing us to embody the fear that is under the clinging. But as we embody the fear, we finally integrated the fear of real annihilation, like where there's nothing to hold on to, nothing inherently to hold on to, including even spiritual stuff. Then that's even more alive, because the fear gets embodied, and all that energy that was spent in defending or holding on to that as truth is freed up in some way. I feel that just talking about that. My whole body feels that aliveness. Strangely, like truly letting go of everything, it's exhilarating. But in some strange and ironic way, it's the letting go of everything and seeing that nothing is inherent. Like everything that you thought was real isn't what it appeared to be. It's somehow in that is where you can welcome back the relative reality, when you know that it doesn't create the suffering anymore. Or if it does create the suffering, then that area can get looked at. See that? So there's no fear in this. That's not the right way of saying it. There's nothing that gets excluded. Nothing. What would be excluded from this would be based in some avoidance or something. So I don't know if you're following me here, but just consider it for a second, just sitting there quietly, of letting go of everything that you hold dear. every program that you have about yourself, every story, but also every belief system, even subtle belief systems around government, politics, all of that seen through, even your spiritual stuff, even your most precious spiritual insights, beliefs, concepts. Whew, can't hold on to that. Even your final language, even the thing that I'm saying now, can't hold on to that as being anything inherent or objective at all. That's alive. And in that seeing, then, you can welcome back the relative reality knowing that it isn't objective or inherent. And you can play in that. And any area in there that gets you entangled or any sense of separation coming back, trauma, it's all grist for the mill. Everything. So nothing gets excluded. That's going to include your whole body. Because that's where you'd be holding on to that fear. The fear of that kind of annihilation, the fear of that would be held somewhere in the body. So you're going to feel it when you let go of that. If you do a body scan right now, just feeling into the inner body right now, you can find the evidence of where your separation still resides. You may not even know what you're believing yet. Still, you may not have identified that because it's really unconscious. But if you could just do a body scan, your body's telling you everything. So when you scan down, look for those areas that feel congested or tight or contracted or dense or like a feeling of emptiness, but not the good kind of emptiness, like emptiness like lack, contracted heart, contracted throat, whatever else, even an entire torso that feels dense. There's your way in right there. See, because a lot of this stuff has shown up for me and people doing this work. When it shows up, when you go deeper, what happens is that you encounter something in your life that hasn't been included. Like for me, it was the anger repression, or maybe for you, it's an addiction or a worldview, a spiritual framework, something that you're still holding on to, but you can't really see it all. It's unconscious. Maybe other people can see it, but to you, that's just reality. And maybe you don't have a sense of your attachment to these things or how much you still believe this or that because it's hiding from you, but your body tells you everything. So as you scan down and you feel that density here or the contraction there, that's like a portal. And if you're skillful with that somatic sensation, it'll all come up for you. Everything that you're still clinging to for identification, but on an unconscious level. So the body's like a way in to see these things that we're still holding on to. And then as you do inquiry with that or whatever your process is, and that gets seen through, the body changes, becoming more and more translucent, energy flowing, no stagnancy, pain relieving, contractions dissolving, that kind of thing. And then that's telling you, so you can trust your body even on the, as you go deeper and deeper, trusting your body. Oh, what is this right here? Feeling into that, using skillful inquiry questions to pull up the unconscious stuff. Then that gets included, whatever that was being believed. See that? It's quite a beautiful exploration when you see it that way. Oh, I have to go, guys. I will see you later today.